Yeah.
Ready? 2 minutes. 2 minutes ahead. You became a technician. Are you graduated?
I've decided to abandon the divine sciences and pick up the technological sciences. Press escape. I don't know. Because somebody is doing. Do you have a PowerPoint?
Sorry?
Do you have a? Thank you. Do you have a PowerPoint? What is this? You have a PowerPoint.
Yeah, but don't move this.
Oh, but I got to show the PowerPoint.
PowerPoint is there.
They can see the PowerPoint through the videos, both the cameras also. But if you want to share it, you can share that.
Yeah, did you want the PowerPoint up there?
Well, we need just the first slide, and then at the end,
Yeah.
the other slides.
Yeah, we're gonna need for the point.
Okay, how do you oh, Fatima, okay. How did you
Go back. I'm gonna go back. Yeah, see this.
watch?
What you did.
I didn't do that, you did that. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, you're. Where did the PowerPoint go?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm professor at the theology department here at Boston College. So welcome to this memorial for Gustavo Gutiérrez. A group of Latin American, Latinx, and American theologians from 6 universities in the United States organized this ritual to remember the life and work of the universal beloved Peruvian Gustavo Gutiérrez. We wish to foster a living memory of his theological and spiritual legacy among us, and to recognize him as an ancestor following the First Nations tradition, within the tradition of the original peoples of Abya Yala and Africa. This calls for a new connection with him, and some of us knew him personally, while others knew him through, and as Laurel Potter says, know him already in the resurrection, that is by way of others. We have prepared an altar de muertos, altar of the dead, following Mexican and Latin American tradition, using some Peruvian colors and symbols. On it, we placed flowers, bread, candles, and pictures of Gustavo, which remind us of his passing among us during his earthly life and his presence with us today in the Holy Spirit. On All Saints' Day, we symbolically conclude a novenario in some way, the practice of popular piety in Latin America, to live in mourning together along these 9 days of remembrance. May the living memory of Gustavo Gutiérrez encourage new languages and practices to praise the God of life, el Dios de la vida, and commit ourselves to serving the poor and the little ones of the kingdom of heaven. And now I yield the floor to Ernesto Valiente, the host of this session, professor at Boston College Klaus School of Theology and Ministry.
Thank you, Carlos. Is this on? Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all of you for being here. Really appreciate your company, especially on a warm Friday. I thought it would be helpful to begin our celebration with a brief biographical sketch of Gustavo Gutiérrez's life, since perhaps not everybody here is familiar with him. So let me begin with that, and then I will pass the microphone to our colleagues who are going to give different reflections from different parts in the United States. Gustavo Gutiérrez was born on June the 8th, 1928, in Lima, Peru, to a family of Quechua and Spanish ancestry. He grew up in a very close and supportive family. His childhood was marked by sickness of the osteomyelitis. Osteomyelitis is an infection of the bone that kept him bedridden for a long periods of time. While this illness limited Gustavo's capacity for movement, it offered him the opportunity to read and reflect extensively. He initially pursued medicine at the Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, but later he shifted his focus, thanks God for us, into theology. As a seminarian, Gustavo studied at the Catholic University in Leuven and in the Catholic University in Lyon, France, where he was introduced to the French Nouvelle Theologie and theologians like Yves Congar, Henri de Lubac, and particularly Marie-Dominique Chenu. He was very fond of Chenu. In 1959, Gutiérrez was ordained to the priesthood in Rome, but he wanted to return to Peru and work in his country, so he got a position at the Pontifical Catholic University. Gustavo also became an advisor to the National Union of Catholic Students. This position allowed him to travel around Peru, kept a pulse on the social dynamics of the nation, and generate close relationships between his pastoral and his theological work. This was a time of broad and social political awakening, with intellectuals, workers, peasants, and other groups in society all questioning the status quo. As Gutiérrez himself described it, Latin America was undergoing a full process of revolutionary ferment that called for a new ways of confronting, and I quote, the untenable circumstances of poverty, alienation, and exploitation in which the greater part of the people live. A few years later, in 1965, Gustavo attended the final session of the Second Vatican Council, which was pivotal in shaping his theological outlook. Then, only 3 years later, he participated in the Medellin Conference as theological advisor, where his ideas on liberation, poverty, and social justice significantly shaped the conference discussion. As we know, the final document of Medellin marked a radical shift in Latin American Catholicism. The author of numerous books and articles, Gutiérrez is perhaps best known for his Theology of Liberation, which was first published in Spanish in 1971 and translated into English 2 years later. While his book has become the fundamental text of Latin American liberation, in his early years, its orthodoxy was questioned by the most conservative sectors of the church. It is indeed a common misperception that Gutiérrez was sanctioned by the church. But although his work was closely examined, scrutinized, this never happened. Over the years, Gutiérrez's works continued to spark a strong opposition because they reveal how Christian revelation exposes the link between injustice and the ethical ambiguities within our social system and institutions. By entering into conversation with the poor, Gustavo made of theology a tool for the church conversion, as well as an instrument of God's reign. The last 25 years, witnessed some significant changes in the life of our friend Gustavo. In 1999, he entered the Dominican order, and in 2000, he was offered an academic chair at the University of Notre Dame, a position he held until moving permanently back to Peru in 2019. During this time, he was also a frequent guest of the CSTM, coming every summer to Boston College. Gustavo's time in the United States enabled him to form numerous friendships and collaborate with American thinkers, including liberation theologians from the Latinx, Black, queer, and feminist tradition. His relationship with the Vatican also experienced a remarkable transformation, particularly after the election of Pope Francis in 2013. A few years ago, on the occasion of Gustavo's 90th birthday, Pope Francis warmly thanked him for his contribution to, and I quote, to the church and humanity through his theological service and his preferential love for the poor and discarded of society. In a similar way, I want to conclude with two of the many things that I am grateful to Gustavo for. One, I am grateful that Gustavo was always an ecclesial theologian. Gustavo did not do theology for a movement or for himself, but for the church community. He remained a faithful theologian even when church leadership seemed to have given up on him. And second, Gustavo for me exemplified a man of profound integrity, consistently living out what he preached. And as you know, he preached none other than the radical message of our faith. Thank you very much. So our next reflection is coming all the way from Los Angeles, from Nancy Pineda. Nancy Pineda is the T. Mary Chilton Chair of Catholic Theology at Loyola Marymount University and the current president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Neto, and thank you for this great honor to be able to join all of you and to honor Gustavo today. I'm so glad for that. I'm so glad to be here in the midst of many colleagues from across the country, certainly, but especially my Boston College colleagues. So thank you for this. I have a few minutes here, and I just want to use my time to begin with a personal story about the first time that I ever met Gustavo, which was in 1982. In 1982 was the year that he gave a series of lectures that eventually became his book, We Drink from Our Own Wells. It was also the year that his work was under review from the Vatican, as Neto just mentioned, and there was critiques that were being raised at that time. And so that just sets kind of a historical context on what's going on in his life. But in order to share my story, I want to share a little bit about myself, which I think helps to set a context for my meeting of him. As some of you know, I'm Mexican-American. My grandparents have lived for many, many generations in the Chihuahua Desert that spans, of course, the northern part of Mexico and into the southern part of the United States. It spans into New Mexico and southern Colorado. And I come from family that was very, very poor, dirt poor, in fact, and part of the generations who claimed that the border crossed us. And in many ways, that is the story of my family. My parents were very, very poor as well, but they managed to raise myself and my siblings in a middle-class home. And I grew up in El Paso, Texas, so right on the U.S.-Mexico border. Take a bus from the west side of town to the east side, and right along the U.S.-Mexican border. Literally, the home I grew up in is about 15 minutes from the border. And as I was taking that bus to school, I would look to the right and see casas de cartón, houses made of cardboard, and thousands and thousands and thousands of them dotting the skyline in Ciudad Juarez. And that haunted me, that image in high school. And I was trying to figure out, why was it sorry for the lighting here. I'm not sure what's causing that. Why was it that I was born on the north side of the border? And if God loves us all, how can the extreme poverty that so many people know in Ciudad Juarez, how do we make sense of that? And that was a question that really haunted me. So once I finished my undergraduate work, I spent a year as a volunteer doing ministry in Palomas, Chihuahua. I was 22 years old. And I was there from January to December of 1982. In the summer, in June and July, I spent a few weeks in San Antonio, Texas, at the Mexican American Cultural Center. And I at that time took a class in pastoral ministry, and Gustavo Gutiérrez was there teaching. And so I had opportunities to have many conversations with him, and he spent a lot of time visiting with me. We take walks together. And one of the things that enormously struck me about him is that I remember feeling just this uncanny sense that I was in the presence of holiness, and in a way that I had never experienced before. It just emanated from him. And I was so excited to tell him about this work I was doing in Palomas, which I did. And he listened very, very attentively. And then at the end of my conversations with him, as my summer there grew to a close, he stopped me at one point and said, "I have a question for you." He says, "I want to know this commitment that you've made of a year to spend in Palomas, living and working among people who are poor. If this commitment is just for 1 year, or is it a commitment for a lifetime?" I remember when he posed that question to me, time stopped. I was speechless. I even to this day don't remember how I responded, but I remember having this enormous energy that just kind of froze at that point. And his question has haunted me ever since. It constantly invites me to conversion. And largely, I think it's because out of my experience of realizing I had been born on the north side and of the border, and that made a huge difference in the kind of life that I had gone on to live. He talked to me a lot about the preferential option for the poor. He said it's not an option. This is an unreserved commitment to the poor and the vulnerable. And that helped to shape what I was doing with feminicide and the victims of the horrific killing, the women that were being killed in Ciudad Juarez. He talked about the insistence on material poverty in terms of the poor it was not a spiritualized concept for him, that he wanted to be clear that he was talking about those who knew material poverty. And that made such a difference because it helped me, of course, to grapple with what I'd grown up seeing in Juarez. The fact that God's love is gratuitous. And I remember trying to figure out, how is it that I have had so many blessings where I'm surrounded with other people who have not known the same kind of blessing? And I remember he helped me to understand that this is not just due to hard work, but that really there's a gratuitousness to God's love. And so hard work alone is not what creates the kind of blessings that I've certainly known in my life, but that there's also a gratuitousness of God's love. And so how is it that I respond to this? And how do I embrace the people who know so much suffering and such material poverty? And so his own way of organizing that and putting it together by his theology, beginning with an analysis of a social political situation of the poor, led me to look at the poor in terms of women, recognizing that women and children really are the great disproportionate number of the poor, to analyze, in my case, the question of sin, the sin of sexism and misogyny and how the social sciences are crucial to help me in that analysis. And then to read the Bible and history, the history of the tradition, through the experience of the oppressed, and certainly in Juarez, that was something that I needed. I needed to try to grapple with that. And I came to see so many of the women protesting the killings in Juarez and beyond have used the cross as a symbol of resistance and protest. And so to recognize the broken body of Christ and the crucifixion reinterpreted through the bodies, lives, and the death of the crucifixion of the women that have been killed. And so I mention all of these pieces because in many ways, Gustavo Gutiérrez, I am so grateful to him because he helped me to make sense of all of this and really has marked my own theology. And he was such a good friend through many, many years and many conversations we had subsequently. So I will close my remarks here. He made such a huge difference in my own life. And I love him dearly, and I feel very much the loss that we all feel with his passing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for that amazing question that you're leaving us with. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Nancy.
Speak through that one.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you for those questions, that question that you leave us with. Next, we have Carlos Mendoza-Álvarez, who you already know. Carlos is a professor of theology at Boston College. And like Gustavo Gutiérrez, he's also a friar of the Orders of Teachers.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation in memory of Gustavo Gutiérrez. I met Gustavo in person in 2002 when the Peruvian theologian, together with the Mexican-American Virgilio Elizondo, organized a private colloquium at the University of Notre Dame for a group of 15 new generation theologians. Previously, the conference, The Option for the Poor in Christian Theology, was held there, and David Tracy gave the opening lecture. The purpose of this private meeting was to discuss the new challenges for liberation theology in the Middle East. I had read Gustavo passionately since I was an undergrad student at the Dominican Studium in Mexico City 41 years ago, in 1983. If you were born yet. Thanks to Miguel Concha, a notable Dominican ecclesiologist and human rights activist, who initiated us in this way of doing theology. Gustavo Foundational's book, with others by Leonardo Boff, Juan Luis II, and John Sobrino, was a treasure that became part of the bedside books of those generations, daughters and sons of Vatican II, Medellin, and Puebla. Thanks to them, theology came to life and was translated into pastoral programs. In my case, it was the accompaniment of the ecclesial-based communities in the Copilco neighborhood in Mexico City, and the foundation of a human rights center with the advice of brothers Roberto and Benjamin Cuellar, who safeguarded the archives of Socorro Jurídico Cristiano after the assassination of Monsignor Romero, taking to Mexico for some years that invaluable heritage of the historical memory of the victims of the war in El Salvador. When I met Gustavo in person 20 years later, I was surprised by his intellectual sharpness and his passionate defense of the term poor, the material poor, to designate the preferred ones of the kingdom of heaven, following, of course, the biblical narrative. The new generation of that time proposed to complexify the term, to designate other oppressions that also needed to be dismantled, such as gender, race, and ethnic oppression. So we spoke of incorporating different perspectives, such as that of the excluded, the victim, the subaltern, to account for the loving presence of God in the world of oppressions where new forms of liberation were emerging. However, Gustavo did not give much response to these proposals. At the end of that colloquium, we were given a cross by the Cusquinian artist Heriberto Merida, that cross which is in the center of the altar, who I have kept in my studio, that cross since then, not to forget this legacy. In time, I would come to realize the critique that feminist theology, queer theology, and decolonial theology would later make of that first generation liberation theologians. I realize now the importance of their contribution. Their great merit consisted in opening new ways to listen to the poor and excluded in modern times as a historical and eschatological force that, animated by God, transformed humanity's violent history. For all these reasons, I would like to recognize Gustavo today as my ancestor too, listening attentively to the little ones of the kingdom of heaven, the Nepi, continuing to learn from the wisdom of those victims who say enough is enough. The poor first, of course, but with them so many other subjectivities that have been violated, wounded by hegemonic practices and narratives, but resilient in resistance of dignified rage, digna rabia, and with eschatological imagination, creating new wars in the interstices of power. Later, liberationist theologies, Indian, feminist, decolonial, and queer, are offshoots of that intuition of the God of life, liberator of all oppression and death, which Gustavo always sought in his heart and his thoughts, always learning to spell out the loving mystery of God next to the excluded of his time. And I now acknowledge this heritage and this ancestry, placing this Cusquinian cross on the altar, where we wanted to recognize Gustavo as an ancestor of liberation theology, alive in our midst through the gratuities of the God of life, el Dios de la vida. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos, for this decolonial reading of Gustavo Gutiérrez. Our next presenter is Dan Castillo. Dan Castillo is an associate professor of theology at the University of Maryland. You might be familiar with his book. Dan wrote his dissertation on Gustavo's work and the environment, and there he is. Welcome, Dan. The microphone is yours.
Thank you, Neto. It's good to be here with you all, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to reflect on the life and mentorship of Gustavo. A group of British reporters once asked a friend of Gandhi's how it was that Gandhi was able to speak so eloquently and at such length without any prepared notes. The friend, Mahadev Desai, replied, quote, "You and I, we think one thing, say another, feel a third, and do a fourth. So we need notes and files to keep track. What Gandhi thinks, what he feels, what he says, what he does are all the same." End quote. While there are reasons to be wary of making comparisons between Gustavo and Gandhi, I found myself thinking about this foregoing exchange this week and the manner in which the size comment speaks to my experience of Gustavo. Gustavo was a person of profound integrity, and his theology flowed out of that integrity. His thought, his feelings, his words, and his actions were all of one piece. There was a truthful wholeness to him. This integrity might be best understood in relation to one of his more important, though frequently overlooked concepts, that of spiritual poverty. For Gustavo, persons and communities of faith are called to spiritual poverty, which is to say, in faith, they are called to empty themselves in humility before God, not in a self-annihilating way, but rather in a manner that allows them to move closer to their truest selves by becoming more fully attuned and responsive to the wisdom and will of God. Spiritual poverty, or spiritual childhood, requires persons and communities to surrender not only their pride, avarice, hard-heartedness to God, but also their fear and the ways in which they may have internalized narratives of degradation and humiliation. Through the work of surrender, these persons and communities come to be at the disposal of God, open to doing the will of God. Gustavo not only articulated this conceptualization of spiritual poverty, to a profound degree, he lived it out. It was this commitment of his whole person, I'm convinced, that accounted for his consistency of thought, feeling, word, and action. But why empty oneself before God? Why surrender oneself in this particular way? For Gutierrez, the answer is fundamentally because God is love. In emptying ourselves before God, we open to the possibility of receiving and sharing that love which makes present the fullness of life. Though coincidental, it is entirely appropriate that in the wake of Gustavo's death, Pope Francis released an encyclical whose first line reads, "He loved us." This is an essential and recurring theme in Gustavo's work. Through Jesus and the Spirit, God has loved us first and invites us to know and respond to that love. Indeed, it is this divine love that grounds love of neighbor and moves persons and communities to solidarity and protest at situations that mock, degrade, and do violence to human life. For as surely as God favored Abel's offering over that of Cain, divine love exhibits a preferential option for the poor, marginalized, and oppressed, demanding in love personal, cultural, and political economic metanoia. Again, as a testament to his profound integrity, Gustavo's whole person bore witness to that love. A tangible sign of the love that Gustavo had for others and for the world was his sense of humor and his laughter. Anyone who knew him quickly came to know his mirth. It was dependably present. But its consistency should not obscure the fact that it was remarkable. Remarkable in that a person who was so intimately familiar with the sin of the world, with the brutalities of injustice, dehumanization, apathy, and greed, could still emit such joy in his way of being. But perhaps it is not all that surprising. In Resurrection Hope, Kelly Brown Douglas notes the subversive function of laughter. Laughter works to de-absolutize the wretchedness that characterizes so much of history. In its relativizing power, joyful laughter gives testimony to the reality that sin and death are not ultimate, that they are not the only words spoken within historical reality, nor do they have the final word on life. In its own modest way, then, laughter bears witness to the resurrection. Thus, joyful laughter is a sign of hope, and Gustavo was a person of profound hope. To hope, he writes, and here I'll quote him at length, to hope does not mean to know the future, but rather to be open in an attitude of spiritual childhood to accepting it as a gift. But this gift is accepted in the negation of injustice, in the protest against trampled human rights, and in the struggle for peace and fellowship. Thus, hope fulfills a mobilizing and liberating function in history. Camus was right when, in another context, he said, true generosity towards the future consists in giving everything to the present, end quote. In faith, in love, and in hope, Gustavo gave everything to the present. The world is a better place for it. Gustavo Gutiérrez, friend of God, friend of the poor, presente. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your beautiful words. Our next presenter is Laurel Marshall Porter, who is an assistant professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. She's there. There she is. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I feel very grateful to be here today, and I want to especially welcome some of my students that are here on the Zoom, Brenda and Emily and Marra, who are maybe meeting Gustavo for the first time today. I also feel very small to be among you all today because I never met Gustavo while he was alive in the way that you all are sharing. But I love hearing these anecdotes, kind of sweet life details that make a person come alive, the stories of your mutual care. They say to never meet your heroes, but I think Gustavo may have been an exception to that. It's clear to me that there was something very special about his embodied personhood that you're sharing. Every picture I see of him, his eyes seem to be twinkling, or he's laughing, and I can imagine his belly moving. There's a video of him giving a lecture at BC several years ago that I assigned for my liberation theology class, and he's just, and I mean this as reverence, like this little man in khaki pants taking slow notes, obviously negotiating language worlds and trying to say something true to the people that are listening to him. And he just seems like such a human. So it's such a gift to hear from you all that can kind of describe the corners and the textures of his humanity. What I want to say, I think, can sound a little strange. I never met Gustavo, but I've known Gustavo de la Resurrección, Resurrection Gustavo, for years. That is, that what he leaves us in his writings, in the stories that you're telling us today, and in the word about God that his now complete life testifies to, this is how we will know him from here on out. And I can tell you that it's good news. As we've heard from our friends here, Gustavo let the poor matter to him. He allowed love and relationship to challenge the reigning theological worldviews about hierarchy and the divine will that seemed unmovable in early 20th century Latin America, some 450 odd years into enduring coloniality. He let himself break over the injustices that we deal each other and allowed the imaginary of another way of thinking about what God wants for beloved creation to emerge. In the footnotes and between the lines of meeting minutes of these first generation liberation theologians, we hear Gustavo come back time and time again to the fact of dehumanizing poverty as contrary to the will of God, and that this is the criterion for Christianity. He opens this little door in the overwhelming current of contemporary academic words about God to allow ourselves to find our brokenheartedness revelatory. There's a story I've been reflecting on over the last week or so about Saint Macrina, unmarried 4th century ascetic, sister and teacher of the Cappadocians. In his biography of her, Saint Gregory, her brother, describes the moment of her death as almost imperceptible. Like she was already so facing the beatific vision in her life, so already transparently communicating it to the world around her, such that when she passes, there's no visible change. This is a root of those objectively bananas claims about saints' incorruptibility, that the holy ones among us are such clear beacons of divine inbreaking, so already arrived at creation's destiny to be absorbed and totally infused with God's own being, that at some point they don't need more time. They are already the fully formed word, or dance, or song, or poem, or flower that they were created to be unto eternity. And there's something of this in my experience of Gustavo's death. Obviously, embodied friendship with him enriched your lives in ways I can't totally articulate, and these concrete details of his person, we believe, are part of his resurrection. But I'm also sure that the ways he can speak to us beyond his earthly life are truly him, because that's how I've known him this whole time. And without the life of this little man in khaki pants from Peru who was courageous enough to follow his broken heart and to let love say new words, I'm pretty sure that Christianity wouldn't make much sense to me. I would not be able to articulate much reason for hope. So I'm grateful to all of you who keep him alive for us in real ways, to his mother, to the earth, and to our Creator for his life.
Thank you so much. I love that approach of the resurrection. It's so helpful today. Matthew, our next presenter, he is a doctoral student at the Boston College Theology Department, and you are familiar with him. Welcome, Matthew.
Well, thank you, everybody. In so many ways, I'm always following Laurel. So it's just wonderful in my scholarship, but sometimes literally. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for having me here. Like Laurel, I had never met Gustavo Gutiérrez. I also recognize that, I'm a gringo. My Spanish is terrible, but I've been so moved by Gustavo Gutiérrez, and he's meant so much to me in my own theological formation. So let me just offer more of a personal kind of reflection. For me personally, it's hard to know where to begin my reflections on the life and work of Gutiérrez. I could start by recalling my own reading of his Theology of Liberation for the first time as a 19-year-old freshman at Fordham, and never feeling the same again. Or I could refer to his ressourcement of the incredible life, ministry, and thought of Bartolomé de las Casas as an example that ought to be applied to so many other forgotten ancestors of liberation. Or better yet, I could praise his important and necessary turn to the Christian mystical tradition, when we drink from our own wells, as a source of both comfort and challenge in a world marred by poverty and violence. Any one of these would be a worthwhile starting point. But instead, this afternoon, I'd like to start by admitting something. As I just said, unlike so many of my fellow panelists, I never met Gustavo in person. So today, I'd like to reflect on what he has meant to me as an emerging white US theologian. Another way of putting it might be, what has Ayacucho to do with Boston? In a moving article written in memory of another ancestor of liberation, Ignacio Ellacuría, entitled, "No One Takes My Life From Me, I Give It Freely," Gutiérrez recalled some advice he received from a former teacher. Quote, "There's nothing more practical than a good theory." These words left off the page and have remained with me both as a challenge and orienting principle of my work, and I hope my life. But of the thousands upon thousands of words written by Gustavo Gutiérrez, what was it about this short aphoristic statement that moves me so much? I think of at least two reasons. So given my social location, I must admit a temptation to think of liberation theology as just one more theoretical framework among so many that must be learned, critically engaged, and perhaps surpassed on the way to some newer word about God. The truth, however, is that there has always been a dynamism at the heart of Gutiérrez's outrageous claims about God's preference for the least and the last that I have yet to transcend. Gutiérrez expresses a singular insight in theology. This, of course, does not mean that he had all the answers or was unaffected by some of the biases of his own context. But I think it does mean that even those most loving critics of his readily admit the fundamental truth of his insights. In that beautiful essay eulogizing Ellacuría, I think Gutiérrez clarifies the theory he's working with. He wrote, quote, "As a Christian and as a philosopher, Ignacio was an impassioned devotee of the human person, the sacrament of God in history." Let's linger with those words a moment longer. The human person, the sacrament of God in history. If there's a theory at work in Gutiérrez, that must be it. Translated differently, we might call it the preferential option for the poor. This leads me to my second point. Gutiérrez's aphorism that there's nothing more practical than a good theory demands that theory must always be actualized. If one takes a good theory as practical, as true, as not simply a thought in the mind, but an affect of the heart, then everything changes. Indeed, in Gutiérrez's words, I found for myself an invitation into the unfolding enactment of the already but not yet presence of the kingdom of God. Indeed, that invitation is ultimately one of friendship. How can we forget Gutiérrez's demand that, quote, If you claim to love the poor, then you must tell me their names. But for me, as a relatively privileged theologian, emerging theologian, I should say, who is often distant from the realities of which Gutierrez speaks, the preferential option for the poor requires more than simply friendship from me. It requires even more than a personal lament for my country's and my society's historical and ongoing impoverishment of the epistemic South. A dangerous temptation that all too often allows people like me to wipe our hands clean via virtue signaling. Gutierrez requires treating the preferential option for the poor, that is, the recognition of the sacramental nature of every human life, as if it were indeed true already, and then gradually orienting myself, my theology, my role in the institutions of which I'm a part, around that conviction, around that truth. So let me finish with this. What might happen instead of saying preferential option for the poor, we always added a descriptor to finish the thought. What would it look like for those of us in this room and online as well to ask ourselves, what does the preferential option for the poor look like in the church? What does the preferential option for the poor look like at Boston College? What does the preferential option for the poor look like in our public policy? It's not simply the preferential option for the poor. It's always the preferential option for the poor in relation to something concrete. Such questions require a theory of solidarity, obviously. But that theory must be made practical. So for someone like myself, Gutierrez has invited me to canonically divest myself as a gatekeeper, and instead embrace the invitation to become a co-conspirator of the reign of God. This, for me, best encapsulates Gutierrez's ongoing legacy. Thank you, Gustavo, for the invitation.
It seems to me that Gustavo must be smiling for the future of theology, you know, the emerging theologians that are coming up. Our next presenter is a good friend of Gustavo. Leo Guardado is an assistant professor at Fordham University, and he has spent some time recently, I think, with Gustavo. Welcome, Leo, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Neto. And thanks to all of us for gathering. Let me just say a few words on the spot. Gustavo would always emphasize, of course, that there's nothing more demanding than that which is freely given. And I feel I've received a lot of grace and a lot of freely given accompaniment from Gustavo over the years. And there's a demand that comes with that I try to sit with and figure out what it means. I just start by that, say I arrived in Notre Dame almost by accident, I would say. I was not accepted into the MTS program. And by the grace of God and by people who intervened, I ended up at Notre Dame to study patristics for my MTS. When I arrived, Tim Adovina was the first person that I met, and the second person was Virgilio Elizondo, and quickly thereafter, Gustavo Gutiérrez. And when Tim, who's with us today, actually picked me up at the airport, I knew no one. Never been to Indiana. And he said, "Are you going to take Gustavo's class?" And I said, "Oh, who's Gustavo and what's he teaching?" And he said, "It doesn't matter what he's teaching, it's Gustavo." And I said, "Okay, first lesson, if someone gives you advice and they know what you should do, maybe really consider." So I did. It was a doctoral seminar on Las Casas. So it was a deep dive all of a sudden. I said I was there to study really patristics because I wanted to join a Trappist monastery. And then there I was, in the middle of a doctoral seminar. And I remember, I write about this in Spanish and in a book that came out a few years ago. I remember sitting there and something happening deep in your entrails when things just start shifting. And I realized I was being given vocabulary to speak and understand and process my own people's experience in El Salvador and Latin America. And it was doing something, as much as I love patristics, that was new and revealing and unveiling my own world to myself 500 years ago. Soon thereafter, I met Victor Carmona, who was Gustavo's assistant, and through him, I got to know Gustavo more personally, essentially because I ended up helping him with computers. Gustavo was into tech, and at times he would get himself in a mess, and so I would go and I know a little about computers and kind of get him out of that mess. And out of that, he was eternally grateful, in the way I got to have access to the world of Gustavo. What did I learn from Gustavo? The importance of la pastoral, that la pastoral, what we call pastoral context. And I was just in Rome, I was speaking with an ecclesiastical leader there who said, in Spanish, it's just la pastoral. It's a noun. In English, it's always an adjective, pastoral work, pastoral context. There's a qualitative epistemological difference there. And for Gustavo, it's not either or, it is always both and, pastoral and theology. You don't do theology without la pastoral. And la pastoral must arise, must be the foundation of theological thought. And we know that. But I just want to emphasize that because even though I'm in an academic department teaching theology, not in a community, it is that pastoral context, however we qualify it, however we speak of it, in whatever mode it comes across in each of our particular vocations, it is that accompaniment of the world, a violent world, a suffering world, that grounds all of our theological thought. And I hold on to that, and I hold on to Gutierrez's affirmation that theology is an ecclesial function. It is a function of the people of God. It's a function of those of us who choose to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, wherever that takes us. And for Gustavo, it's clear that it arose out of a profound prayer life that we may even say was mystical in its own way. And I think it's that grounding so profound in prayer, in almost apophatic prayer, that allowed him to be so free with the church, not from the church, but with the church, with the rest of those of us who feel called for a mission in this world to continue the memory of Jesus. So that contemplative, that mystical experience, I think, was really the key, and that prayer life, the key for his profound thinking. And it comes across, I think, in his writings. He was so careful with words, so nuanced. I mean, his sentences in Spanish have like 5 subclauses. And you say, this is like German. Can we just make this into 3 sentences? But he was so careful with words because he knew that words could heal and words could wound. So you don't find Gustavo attacking people. You don't find him name calling. He may take on an idea and he may utterly destroy another idea, but he doesn't do that to people. He did not demonize. And I bring that because his theology is so profoundly nonviolent. I think it's because he was so aware of the violence that even our theologies carry. And of course, this arises out of such proximity to the worlds of, I'm going to say, Las Casas of 500 years ago. I think personally that, my perspective, that his book on Las Casas is his magnum opus. I mean, 700-page book, the most kind of, I would say, footnoted book that he wrote that took over 20 years. I think for Gustavo, there was this fundamental understanding that what happened 500 years ago in the Americas is being played out in a different form in our modern world. And I have the privilege of and responsibility of, for the past couple of years, been editing his final work in Spanish. And the last chapter returns us to the challenge of religious pluralism, the challenge of religions, not just the grand religions, but las pequeñas religiones del mundo, the little religions of the world, the Amazonian, for example, religions. And I think it's an open kind of window or door for Christians to continue to think about the other, those who are constructed as others, and what God is telling the church through communities that we often envision as outside in some way or another. Maybe by kind of wrapping this up, let me just say that I was in Peru visiting him a month ago. I was giving a lecture at Holy Cross, and I just flew from Boston to Lima. I got a call that he wasn't doing well. This is a month ago. He lived a few weeks after that. And I just would visit him 3 times a day. And he had a little morphine. And so I think maybe partly that but he kept pointing to kind of things on the wall. And I would tease him, it's the spirits, I said. It's all of your ancestors coming to visit you. It's your mom, it's your father, it's all your friends whom you've lost. And across the years, he would say, Leo, I've lost so many of my friends already. And I said, this is the communion of saints who is accompanying you and inviting you to a great banquet. I said, say yes, say yes. And in the process, I would get emails from people and I would say, so-and-so sends their greeting. I know, and I would read them the email, so-and-so remembers you. He was so moved by the fact that it said these worlds that have been in a way separated, the Latin American world, the US world, that he had the European world, we were coming together in prayer around him in his last days. So to conclude, I guess I'll end with, I remember a homily from Gustavo years ago when he said, we're all called to be John the Baptists. We're not called to be Jesus necessarily, but to point the way to Jesus. I feel very much, I try to do that. I said, I teach here a class just on Gustavo's thought. And in my own way, I try to teach to my students, La Pastoral, the people of God, history, where is God in the world now? And I think one of the legacies that Gustavo leaves us is continue to point the way, know how to discern the world and the spirit of God in the world, and point the way to Jesus. It sounds very traditional in one sense, but I think it's the most traditional way of speaking about the truth of Gustavo. All that he did and all the thinking that he did came out of his love for the mystery of God and God present in the world, especially among the most insignificant of the world. As he was losing his capacity to speak, one of the last things he said months ago was, he said, pobrecito yo. He said, I've always been so good with words. Now I can't speak. He said, pobrecito yo. He realized by the end of his life, he had very much become, one of the poor of this world, more and more trapped in his own self. So just thank you for organizing this space and for giving us a chance to remember and continue his legacy.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you for spending those very hard and difficult moments with him at the end of Gustavo's life. Thank you. Now we have our next presenter is another good friend of Gustavo, Raúl Zegarra, who is assistant professor of Roman Catholic Theological Studies at Harvard, a newcomer to Cambridge. Welcome, Raúl.
Thank you. Difficult to follow friends, especially Leo. I want to say buenas tardes a la gente en Perú, en otros lugares via Facebook Live, Zoom, and to you here. Thank you for coming. It's a very special day for me, for many of us here. Thanks to Carlos and Neto, I was thinking that you learned from Gustavo to really organize, because in the US, so Latin American, you don't get an event put together in a week. These guys did it in 5 days. So kudos to you. Congratulations for what you did for us. I want to be especially thankful for inviting me to reflect on the life of this dear friend of mine, Gustavo. And I'll focus on the question of friendship as my way to close these reflections. And I want to think about not my last time with Gustavo, which was also close to the time Leo was there a month and a half ago or so. But the last time I visited Gustavo in his house in Barranco, one of the neighborhoods of Peru, where his family lived for many years, before he moved to an apartment in Jesus Maria, closer to friends of his that could visit him more often. I was actually there, I think it was the Christmas time of 2021. And I was there, and I was there with my wife, remember, and it was one of the last times I remember Gustavo was more eloquent and capable of talking and all that. And I brought to Gustavo a book that was just published by my colleagues in Peru on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Liberation Theology in 1971. And I asked Gustavo, as I have asked a few times, to sign it for me. I have a little collection of Gustavo books signed with different thoughts every time. But this was a special time because Gustavo was starting to struggle. I don't know if I can say this without crying, but and then Gustavo wrote at the top, and I remember he started writing, and he stopped, he looked at me, and said like, "No puedo más." And then I didn't actually look at the book until later that day. I think he went to the bathroom or I did or something. And the only thing he wrote was "Grandes amigos," great friends. He left there, couldn't go further. So I thought that that's maybe a good way to think about Gustavo's legacy, at least his legacy for me, but I think for many in this call, in this room, perhaps those who met him in the flesh and those who have met Gustavo in the resurrection. Friendship was key to Gustavo's way to inhabit the world, to do theology, and really to relate to people. I just realized that I didn't time myself, but hopefully this works out. I experienced that, and many of you did, this way to just offer himself freely, honestly, open-handedly, open-mindedly. Gustavo was really about friendship. I wrote a little tribute to Gustavo a few days ago for publication, and one thing that I said is that I always remember my interaction with Gustavo as rarely focused on theology or scholarship, although that will happen at some point. It was always about the personal touch, this attentiveness to what's going on with your life, subtle, with humor, as several remember, but really personal approach to you as interlocutor. And you feel sometimes in readings, when you read Gustavo, you feel this kind of a strong connection to people and to the potential reader. So I think about this in connection to one of his last lines in the introduction to Liberation Theology, the 1988 edition, 20 years after Medellin. Toward the end, Gustavo is talking about friendship with the poor. And toward the end, he has this beautiful line that I always make my students focus on. There is no love unless we are equals. No hay amor si no somos iguales, or something like that. And a few lines after, this is set in the context of how you develop a connection to people who live in poverty. And the point that for that, you need to have friendship with people who experience that. That was key for Gustavo. And in a way, you can think about this as an analog to this idea of the preferential option for the poor. There was a preferential friendship for people who live in poverty. You could tell that. We will see some images in a moment, and you will see some of that in his smile that we can relate it to others. But there is also something about his universal willingness to make friends. They always talk about the universal love of God and the preferential love for God. But he was a bit like that himself. He was friends with everyone, right? And then he had a special connection, friendship, especially with the people of his parish. So just to close here, I was thinking in terms of legacy, in terms of the future. And I think that Gustavo modeled a way to do theology and way to think about us as mentors, as pastors, as teachers, really driven by friendship, really focused on being available to your students, to your community, to the people, being able to listen, being there for them, even when you disagree. And that legacy of friendship and love is the thing I remember the most from Gustavo, beyond the books, beyond the articles and presentations. So I'm very thankful for this chance to speak. And I think I want to talk about some pictures that we have. Is that what happens next? Or
Sure, we can do the pictures now,
okay,
and then we're gonna open soon.
Perfect. So there is a little presentation, I think. Is it already? So PowerPoint. There we go. So there's a few pictures that we collected for this presentation. Thank you, Carlos, especially for this. So this one, the first one on the left, some of you may know Guamán Poma de Ayala, 16th century indigenous Peruvian who wrote to the king to just say, look, what is happening here, recolonization and destruction of the Americas. And then this artist, Raúl, created an image model after the drawings of Las Casas de Nueva Crónica en Buen Gobierno with Gustavo. We have also one here in the altar, it's very beautiful. Then you have that picture of Gustavo. I think that's from 79, 80. There's an assembly of the Instituto Pastoral Andina, an institute for work in the south of Peru. Can we see the next? This one on the left side is Gustavo, also the IPA, speaking to, as you see, a pretty large crowd. You see the books there, you know, the blackboard, and Gustavo in a very kind of serious image. And then you have Gustavo on the other side in his parish, in Lima, just looking with the kids, a beautiful picture, just to what's going on in, you know, the neighborhood. That was Gustavo again, you know, parish priest, even though he was a great theologian. Then you have this picture with the colleagues of the Catholic University of Peru, Suero, Felipe Zegarra, who that was year 2, Calderón there, Pedro de Buchinech, I think it's Fernando Frescos on the other end. I'm missing somebody there, but friends of Gustavo, by the way, who have been doing theology and building community for 50 or 60 years together. It's amazing. The bottom here, I'm not sure, this is the Catholic University 2018. It's a group of students. Can we see the next one? This is, so people here are there. That's Neto, Leo Guardado, Michael Lee, Victor Carmona. This actually was, if I remember correctly, in 2018 in Lima. We were together in Colegio de Jesus, right? In kind of a seminar that Gustavo was running, and we were all there. It was fantastic. The other one is in La Casa of Catalina Romero, Virginia. So it was a big get together, and you see a prayer for Victor Carmona asking for something for Gustavo. Neto's in the back. Timarovina, I think, is at the other end. Next one. This is a picture here. Well, I guess it's not in Boston College proper, but in the retreat house. Where's the name of that place? Anyways, this is actually a meeting of theologians in 2016. There's some heavy hitters there. Harvey Fox is there, Neto Valiente, Carlos Mendoza, Gustavo, you can see him at the end. There's Scanone before he died, next to Gustavo. It's such a great group of people. I'm also there somewhere. But it was a beautiful meeting of people who were makers of theology in Latin America for many, many decades. This one on the left side is Gustavo's retirement from Notre Dame in 2019, though Guardado was translating, I think. Here a little nice frame. The one in the middle is in Gustavo's apartment, another one I mentioned, but the one in Costa Maria, when he moved there, with a great friend, Andres Gallego, for many, many years. That's like in me the same day, maybe. I book I found it. Actually, the cover is one of the pictures we saw a moment ago. And there's a few more, including his going into the Dominican order, discovery of Professor Mendoza-Álvarez. Is that it? Okay. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Raúl. I have to say this because it's inviting me, as everybody has been talking. You have been talking, Raúl, about friendship, and before then was talking about sacrament. I'm going to give you an example of what kind of sacrament was started with. I was PTA, so I would spend the day with you. I would get home at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And my wife is here and she can attest to this. So when we were getting ready to eat or whatever, and I would just kind of walk around the apartment, and I would say to Carrie, every time I spend my day with this habit of peace, I can feel better. I just feel hopeful. I feel like a better human being. So I believe I want to give that testimony. You know, he was a sacrament for his friends, a sacrament of God for his friends. So this is one of the issues we have with Gustavo. He has too many friends. And everybody wants to talk. And I know some of his friends are right now in Zoom, and some of them would like to share some words with us. And I would like us to welcome that. Just ask you, those who are in Zoom, to be a little concise. So do we have anybody who is ready to speak? When you raise your hand so we know. I see Tom Groom. Tom Groom asked me that he wanted to say a word. Okay. Hold on. Wait, because you are still muted.
One second.
You are muted, Tom.
Oh, here it is.
Is it now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Is it okay? Okay. I am just so inspired by all the speakers and the memories. And I just want to add a funny story. Gustavo, as somebody mentioned, came to teach for us many times in our summer institute at Boston College. It was a rather famous summer institute. It ran for about 40 summers. And I was privileged to direct it for most of the time and to invite Gustavo regularly. He came at least 10 times, maybe 12. To teach for us each summer. He's just such a great gift and such a wonderful friend. But every time I would call him and invite him to come teach for us that summer, he said, Tom, I have one question. Is White Mountain Creamery still there? Is it still open? And I was, oh, yes, Gustavo, White Mountain is there to the good. Oh, good. Then I will come. And sure enough, he just had a love for ice cream. And most evenings after when he would be finished in his room, he would ramble down to White Mountain. And of course, there'd be lots of students there waiting to chat with him. And I just thought it was extraordinary that this extraordinary little man was the terror of popes and dictators. Here he was with a passion for ice cream and delighted to share it with his students. So that's my fond memory of him.
Thank you, Tom. And I also saw my old friend, Tim Matovina there, and I know how close Tim was to Gustavo. So, Tim, do you want to share some words with us? Hold on a second. Let's wait until we get you.
There you go. 1 second. Where's Tom?
We're looking for you in the Zoom.
I think he's already unmuted.
Yeah, I think we're already unmuted.
Oh, there he is. He's over there. You have to find him.
Can you say something?
I think you can just go to him.
There we go.
Okay, is it okay to speak, Neto?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this beautiful, and Carlos, Neto, all of you, what a beautiful event. I'm here with Amira Orozco, another wonderful student who's still learning from Gustavo. There's so many stories to tell. I don't know which one to tell. We are going to have a memorial at Notre Dame a week from Monday, and I'll give a little eulogy at that. It's also going to be available if anybody wants to come in for another celebration of Gustavo. So one story. Tom, thanks for your great story. Nice to follow an Irishman who's also a storyteller. One of my favorites of Gustavo, he would say this a lot of times. I heard him say this to students, to faculty. He was always reminding us, he would say, theology must give, Laurel, you said this so beautifully in your words. Theology must give suffering people a concrete reason for their hope. It's echoing the first epistle of Peter. And he'd say that over and over again. He'd say, you can have a beautiful reflection on the Bible or some theological concept, but if it doesn't give marginal suffering people a real reason for hope, it's not theology. It's just simply not theology. Theology can't just be intellectual thought and reflection, as Leo was saying about lo pastoral. It's got to give suffering people a real reason for hope. And that was one of his mantras. Of course, you can read great texts in A Theology of Liberation about what the purpose of theology is. But that's how I heard him summarize it in person with great passion. Remember how he used to wave his hands when he was making big points? He would sing this, it's got to give a real reason, concrete reason for hope, or it's not theology, not theology at all. And that's one of the memories I always take with him. It's a hard challenge to live. But when I try to teach myself, I often have that thought from Gustavo in the back of my mind. Thank you for these beautiful moments today, all of you. Muchas bendiciones. Gracias.
Gracias, King. Amira, you want to say a word?
Sure, I didn't plan to, because similarly to Laurel and Matt, I met him once. So I was not friends with him, so I can't give a reflection. Actually, it was thank you to Leo Guardado, and Leo was there for the meeting that happened a few days after the death of Pope Benedict XVI as well, which was it was in these moments where Gustavo was no longer able to articulate super well, but similarly to Nancy, who also shared, I think, just being around him even when he wasn't wasn't even saying words that were necessarily somehow profound. There was this real sense of you're around somebody who's a saint. And I think I've only had that experience maybe one. I've had the experience twice, and actually a classmate at Boston College and Gustavo Gutiérrez are the only two people who I've ever really had that experience with. No offense to everybody on this. You all are great. I'm great. Have affected me a lot, including Tim. But really truly like that experience was and the other impression that day gave me was this like real sense of humility in a man who you would never expect humility from, in terms of like somebody who's just done great things. When I walked in, there was a sense of like, why would you come talk to me? Like, there's so many things to do and people to see in Lima. And yet like you come to this to my apartment and to my place, which was, I've taken with me as I continue on to further theological studies. And so, yeah, thank you, Neto.
Thank you, Nina. Anybody else?
Buenas tardes a todos. Hola. I am Magali Torresno. I'm Peru. I met Gustavo since I was 6 years old. Now I am 63, so I'm a kid for it. I was going, I don't know the Peru, Chiclayo, and the priest and the Sister St. Joseph. Now I am Associate Sister St. Joseph. So Sister St. Joseph was found for epilepsy in 1650 in France. So every summer, the priest from Canada and Sister St. Joseph took the youth group to go into Lima. For us was like, wow, we are going to start, they call Jornada de Teología en la Universidad Católica. Y nos quedábamos, we were en el Colegio de Jesús, por la Avenida Brasil, por Guardado. And so being with him, so 1 week in Lima for youth coming from the small towns that was big deal. But deciding in Lima for 1 week, attending las jornadas de teología, Gustavo con todos, Jorge, todos los amigos, Felipe, Zegarra, Jorge, todos los que ya han pasado, ya han muerto. So being with them, but Gustavo came to stay with us the whole week. So it was like plus. So we have Gustavo plus. So can you believe the long conversation we have with him? Later, when I was studying agricultural engineer, and so I was member of the UNEC, Unión Nacional de Estudiantes Católicos. So the Catholic associations, bachelor's, college level, every summer we have meetings. Gustavo was the mentor for 20 years in UNEC. So every summer when we get together in Lima, so we came from everywhere, the first thing he said, he asked like, each of us, theology en español. Teología es la reflexión de la práctica. Si tú no haces pastoral en tu pueblo, ¿qué vienes a hacer acá? ¿Qué vas a reflexionar? Nada. So in English, so theology is the reflection of your practice. If you don't do pastoral in your town, well, you're here in Lima. You're wasting your time. So he was very strict with us. So every summer we have to come here and reflect. So I decided to join Sister St. Joseph, and I went to the Salvador. It was the 80s. So the Sendero Luminoso was, muy fuerte el movimiento. So people with Gustavo, the group of all priests. So Gustavo one day said, we were like the lettuce and the sandwich. Because in one way, the government, they say, oh, Gustavo, to the youth, this is people for Sendero, join Sendero. He prepares youth to join Sendero. On the other hand, Also la guerrilla, Sendero. Sendero say, from Ayacucho, they are neighbors to Puno. At that time, el sur andino era un grupo, there's a big group of bishops and priests. Most of the clerics come from Europe and USA. But there was a strong grupo, sur andino. So la guerrilla, Sendero Luminoso, decía, we couldn't go to Puno because las comunidades eclesiales de base. Porque el pueblo no nos dejó entrar. Because the SEPs, the eclesial-based community. But we can go to Lima, but we can't go to Puno. So Sendero Luminoso hate the church. They say, you are the only organization who stopped going to Puno. So for both sides, we were, it was like, fighting like against the status quo. So it was very important as in my life. So when I become associate in St. Joseph, and I came to USA 25 years ago, I did my PhD in Southern University in community economic development. So when Gustavo came here, I was his driver. So I took him to everywhere. So he is the godfather of my little one, Richie. And so when he came, he said, Magali, what are you doing? And I said, the last time he came was when Father Leahy gave some recognition. So I took him from the airport. It was November. He didn't have a jacket. And my tallest 5'6". And he said, Padrino, ¿usted no trajo un jacket? Y él dice, no, I have. So my son took his jacket and gave his Padrino. And he was like, like the jacket was like, abrigo largo. And he said, Gustavo, you are in Boston. So when I say, Gustavo, where do you want to give the first communion to my son? In DC, because he was in St. Mary, or in East Boston, the Most Holy Redeemer, those many Peruvians, hard workers, immigrants, the answer. He said, and sing the Most Holy Redeemer to the people. So he gave very nice mass. I called Peruvians, Gustavo is going to be here. And so he enjoyed to be, they make papa la huancaína, ceviche. So he was very, very grateful. So when he said, Magali, what are you doing? Are you doing the pastoral, la pastoral en la periferia? Are you doing that? And I said, yes. I found Latina Centro Maria, it's a nonprofit, and I work in Lynn, where is the second school district, the largest school district, the second after Boston, with Latinos. 75% of the students are Latinos. I am a teacher over there, and I do whatever he said. Be the voice of the voice.
We're going to conclude this beautiful celebration with a little poem from Cesar Vallejo, Gustavo's favorite poet. And it's going to be read by Laurel.
Okay. Yes. No, 1 second. Okay.
All right. So even though the words are up on the screen, I'd invite you, if you feel comfortable, to go ahead and close your eyes. Feel your feet on the ground, the chair supporting you, maybe your hands on your thighs or on your heart. And take a deep breath in gratitude for our time together, coming back into our bodies and our hearts and our brains that are all one thing, and let it out. I feel God walking deep within me, with the evening and the sea. With him we leave. The night falls. With him we nightfall. orphaning. But I feel God. It even seems I take his dictation for some fine color. Like a hospitalist, he is sad and he is good. He languishes, a sweet, disdainful lover. How his heart must ache. Oh my God, it's only now I come to you, this late day, when I am full of love, and turn to the rigged balance of a pair of breasts to weigh and grieve this frail creation. But oh, how you sob, you enamored of such magnificent encircling breasts. I consecrate you, God, because you love so deeply, because you never smile, because of how your heart must always hurt you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, everybody, for being with us. It was really meaningful to have all of you.
Thank you,
Well,
Neto.
welcome. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Francis.
You're welcome, Carl. Well, yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Today's the birthday.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course.